No, she had once trained dogs, deadlier than the ones they unleashed on her. To the officers, she was just another black woman standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, holding her newborn baby close to her chest. But to anyone who knew her past, she was far more than that. She was a decorated veteran, a former military, K9 handler who had stared down enemies overseas and lived to tell the story. That night, though, she wasn't in a war zone. She was on the cracked sidewalks of her own neighborhood in America, her baby's soft cries rising above the sudden shouts of uniformed men. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the quiet evening like knives. The sound of heavy boots against pavement grew louder, accompanied by the low, guttural growl of dogs eager to be released. She froze for a moment, instinctively clutching her child tighter, her body forming a shield around the tiny life in her arms. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. Not out of fear for herself, she had faced fear before, but for her child, who had never yet seen the cruelty the world could inflict. "Hands where we can see them," a voice barked, harsh and impatient. She turned slowly, her posture calm but her spirit burning. The officer's eyes darted between each other, reading from the same unspoken script. Suspicion, judgment, a presumption of guilt before innocence. They saw the color of her skin before they saw the baby in her arms. And in their eyes, that was enough to justify the tension in their grips on the leashes, enough to justify unleashing power on someone who posed no threat. She wanted to speak, to tell them who she was, to remind them that the very freedom they claimed to protect had been safeguarded by her hands and her training. But she knew the weight of her words would collapse under the shield of their arrogance. They weren't listening. They weren't looking beyond the surface. "Stay back!" one of the officers shouted as the dogs lunged forward, straining against their restraints. She felt a tremor in her spine, not from fear, but from the sudden resurgence of muscle memory. She had been on the other side of this command before, with soldiers lined up, watching as she controlled canines trained to detect explosives, to disarm men twice her size. She remembered the trust in those dogs' eyes, the discipline, the unshakable bond that existed between handler and animal. But what she saw in the dogs before her now was different. Their movements were erratic, their training sloppy. They weren't responding to trust. They were responding to aggression. They were being used as weapons, not partners. And she knew more than anyone that this kind of force, in the wrong hands, was not only dangerous, it was reckless. Her baby whimpered softly, his tiny fists clenched, sensing the storm brewing around him. She whispered into his ear, her voice steady and soothing, "It's okay, Mama's here." "I won't let anything happen to you." She had whispered similar words to soldiers, terrified and broken in the midst of combat, but this time was different. This time, it wasn't a war in some distant desert. This time, the enemy wasn't foreign. This time, it was home. The officers exchanged nods, and before she could protest, the first dog was released. The German shepherd charged forward, teeth bared, eyes fixed on her. Time slowed. Her instincts, honed by years of training, took over. She shifted her weight, angling her body so her child was protected behind her arm, while her other hand shot forward, not in fear but in command. "Down!" she shouted, her voice sharp. Layered with authority the dog had never heard from these men. To everyone's shock, the dog skidded to a halt, its ears twitching, its eyes flicking in confusion. She stepped forward, her gaze locked on the animals. "Sit!" she commanded, her tone unwavering, unshakable. And just like that, the beast that had been seconds away from tearing into her obeyed. The officers froze. The neighborhood, lit up by sirens and fear, went silent. The second dog barked frantically, pulling against its handler's leash, but she had already shifted her focus. Her voice rang out again, commanding, familiar, and rooted in years of experience. "Heel!" The dog faltered, torn between the handler's grip and the stranger's voice that carried the authority of someone who had once lived and breathed their world. The animal whimpered, lowering its head, torn but submissive. The men didn't understand what they were witnessing. To them, she was supposed to be powerless. She was supposed to be the one cowering, begging, surrendering. But instead she stood tall, her child still safe in her arms, while the very tools they had unleashed against her bent to her command. "You don't know what you're doing," she said finally, her voice calm but carrying the weight of truth. "These animals aren't toys. They aren't your fists when you run out of words. They're not weapons for you to point at whoever you decide doesn't belong. They are soldiers, partners, and you're disgracing them." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their confidence shaken but their pride unrelenting. They couldn't admit what had just happened, not out loud. They couldn't acknowledge that their Authority had been dismantled by the very woman they were trying to break. But she didn't care for their pride. She cared only for the small heartbeat against her chest and the knowledge that, once again, she had protected someone she loved. This time it wasn't a squad of soldiers or a battalion relying on her skill. This time it was her son. And as she stood there, illuminated by flashing lights and surrounded by silence that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, she realized something powerful. They had underestimated her because of her skin. They had dismissed her because of her gender. They had ignored her because they thought she was defenseless. But tonight she had reminded everyone that she was not a victim. She was a force. What they thought would break her had only revealed her strength, and what they thought would silence her had only amplified her voice. The dogs, now seated calmly at her command, became living proof that her worth could never be measured by their prejudice. The battle wasn't over. She knew there would be consequences. Questions, lies, and attempts to twist the truth. But she also knew this moment had planted something deeper, a seed of defiance, of pride, of dignity that no one could strip away. She had once served her country with loyalty, even when it turned its back on people who looked like her. Now she served her child, her family, her community, and that, she thought, was the highest honor of all. As the baby drifted back to sleep, unaware of the storm that had passed, she looked into the officer's eyes and whispered, not for them, but for herself. You will never define me. Not tonight. Not ever. The street was still humming with the echo of what had just unfolded. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, cell phones raised in shaky hands, recording every second. The officers stiffened as they realized the cameras were everywhere. Now, eyes that would not forget, witnesses they could not silence. The woman, still holding her baby, stood in the flashing light as though she were standing on a stage, unwillingly but unbreakably. "Ma'am, lower your voice," one officer muttered, his tone carrying more desperation than command. But she wasn't shouting. Her voice had been steady, measured, and that unnerved him more than anger ever could. He tugged the leash of his still restrained dog, but the animal refused to budge, its loyalty wavering in the presence of someone who radiated true authority. The neighbors began murmuring, their whispers growing louder, mixing disbelief with outrage. "They sent dogs on a woman holding a baby," someone said. "She made those dogs sit like soldiers," another added. In a neighborhood accustomed to silence under the weight of authority, voices began to rise one by one, like sparks igniting a fire. The officers tried to retreat into procedure, fumbling with their radios, murmuring codes and requests for backup. But the air had already shifted. The power they thought they carried had cracked, their control slipping through their fingers. She turned away from them for a moment, pressing her lips to her baby's forehead. Her eyes softened, but her jaw remained strong. The child stirred, unaware of the storm swirling around him, unaware of the history being written on this night. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked finally, not as a challenge but as a quiet truth. The question lingered unanswered. She didn't wait for their response. Instead, her voice carried the weight of her past. "I've worn your uniform," she said. "I've stood in deserts where the sun scorched the earth and the only thing between us and death were the dogs at our side. I've trained K9s to save lives, not to terrorize women carrying infants. I've taught soldiers how to handle fear, how to control power, how to never mistake obedience for loyalty. I was one of the first women in my unit to command a combat dog in the field. And you..." Her eyes swept across them, steady and unflinching. "You tried to turn those animals into weapons of your prejudice." A silence heavier than the sirens fell over the scene. The crowd leaned closer, their phones steady, their breathing tight. One officer scoffed, but it came out hollow. "Lady, I don't care if you were a general." "No," she interrupted, her voice cutting sharp as steel. "You don't care that I'm a human being. That's the problem." The words hit harder than any raised fist. The crowd erupted with shouts of agreement. Some cursed, others demanded badge numbers, and still others pleaded for restraint, terrified of what escalation could mean for all of them. But the woman didn't flinch. She had faced down men with rifles in foreign streets. She wasn't about to shrink from the truth here at home. Her mind slipped back, unbidden, to the years overseas. She remembered the long nights when her K9 partner, Titan, lay by her side, ears pricked at every sound in the desert darkness. She remembered the missions, where Titan had sniffed out explosives, buried beneath sand that could have swallowed a convoy whole. She remembered soldiers who had lived because of him, soldiers who had died with his bark as the last sound they heard. Titan had been more than a dog. He had been a soldier. And she had buried him with her own hands, tears staining the earth, knowing she had lost more than a partner. Now, looking at the trembling shepherd before her, she saw Titan's shadow. She saw loyalty misused, trust betrayed. These animals had been taught obedience but not respect. And like her community, like herself, they were being used as instruments of control rather than companions in service. Her voice softened, just enough to reach the dog without breaking eye contact with the men. "It's not your fault," she whispered to the animal. And in that moment, it seemed to understand. Its body lowered, its growls fading into a quiet whine, as though even the beast recognized the injustice around it. The crowd gasped, murmuring again, voices thick with awe. "You see that?" Someone shouted. She didn't need a leash. She didn't need force. That dog trusts her more than it trusts you. The officers shifted uneasily. Their radios crackled with incoming chatter, but the words were drowned by the growing unity of the neighborhood. Mothers stepped forward, fathers clenched their fists. Teenagers held their phones higher. The woman's calm defiance had unlocked something raw and unstoppable in them all, the realization that courage, even when quiet, could shift the balance of power. One officer finally snapped. "That's enough! Give me the baby." "You're under..." "Under what?" She shot back, her voice cutting across his. "Under suspicion of being black in America? Under suspicion of protecting my child? Under suspicion of surviving every battle you can't even imagine?" The man froze, his words collapsing under the weight of her truth. He glanced at his partner, but found no support there, only the reflection of the crowd in their wide eyes. The knowledge that every move now was evidence in the court of public opinion. The woman stepped forward, slow and deliberate. She did not run, she did not hide, she did not beg. She carried her child with the dignity of a queen, her presence commanding more authority than their flashing lights ever could. The dogs, once snarling weapons, now sat silently, their ears lowered as though they, too, had chosen their side. "You came here thinking you could intimidate me," she said, "but all you've done is reveal yourselves. And tomorrow, when these videos spread, when the world sees what you unleashed on a mother and her newborn, the only thing you'll wish is that you had listened, that you had seen me, not just my skin." The murmurs of the crowd grew into chants now, justice, dignity, strength. Voices braided together, echoing through the streets, reaching windows and rooftops. The officers stood surrounded not just by bodies, but by truth. Their power no longer came from their badges or their weapons, but from the illusion that people would stay silent. That illusion was gone. And as the chants grew louder, the woman knew this night was not about her alone. It was about every black mother who had feared for her child in a world that too often refused to see their humanity. It was about every soldier who had given their loyalty to a country that sometimes failed to return it. It was about every voice that had been hushed, every story dismissed, every dignity denied. Her baby stirred again, his tiny hand curling around her collar. She smiled softly, whispering against his hair. "We're writing our own story now, and they can't erase it." The crowd pressed closer, protective, encircling her as though she were carrying the weight of them all. For the first time that night, she felt something stronger than anger. She felt solidarity. She wasn't standing alone anymore. She was standing for something greater, something unbreakable. And tonight, the world had witnessed a mother with nothing but her voice, her child, and her past, and it had been enough to silence the roar of sirens. By morning, the videos had already spread far beyond the neighborhood. Clips of her commanding, the snarling dogs with nothing, more than her voice were replayed across every social media platform, dissected on news broadcasts, and analyzed by commentators who could scarcely believe what they were seeing. The image of a black woman holding her newborn while two trained K9s bowed to her authority became a symbol overnight, a symbol of strength, of defiance, of truth too sharp to be ignored. The officer's version of events unraveled quickly. Their official report claimed she had been non-compliant, that she had posed a threat, that the release of the dogs had been justified. But the cameras told another story, one that no carefully crafted words could erase. The world saw what happened. They saw the trembling child. They saw the dogs obeying her commands over their handlers. They saw officers out of control and a mother standing unbroken. Journalists flocked to her doorstep. Some came with sympathy, some with curiosity, and others with skepticism wrapped in polite questions. But she met them all the same way, calm, steady, unflinching. I'm not the story, she told them. The story is what happens to people who don't have a camera. The story is the thousands of women who hold their children tight and pray they survive an encounter like this. I was trained to handle dogs. I was trained for war. Most mothers aren't, and they shouldn't have to be. Her words resonated deeper than the footage itself. The public began asking questions that went beyond her case. Why were officers still being trained? To use dogs as tools of intimidation rather than protection? Why was a woman with military service treated as a threat instead of a neighbor? Why did the badge become a weapon the moment it saw brown skin? In the days that followed, protests swelled. Crowds marched through the city, carrying signs with her likeness, chanting words she had spoken that night. You don't care that I'm a human being? That's the problem. It became a rallying cry, a phrase scrawled across banners, printed on shirts, painted onto walls. Her voice, once directed at a few officers on a dimly lit street, had echoed into something larger, something unstoppable. In the days that followed, protests swelled. Crowds marched through the city, carrying signs with her likeness, chanting words she had spoken that night. You don't care that I'm a human being? That's the problem. It became a rallying cry, a phrase scrawled across banners, printed on shirts, painted onto walls. Her voice, once directed at a few officers on a dimly lit street, had echoed into something larger, something unstoppable. The police department scrambled to contain the fallout. Press conferences were called, investigations announced, and familiar phrases repeated: reviewing procedures, commitment to community trust, ongoing inquiry. But the public was no longer satisfied with promises. They wanted accountability. They wanted reform. They wanted change written not in press releases, but in action. Meanwhile, she returned each night to the quiet sanctuary of her child's room. She would watch him sleep, his chest rising and falling with the innocence of someone untouched by the world's cruelty. She whispered promises into the dark, vows that no matter what battles lay ahead, he would grow up knowing his mother had stood tall when others tried to break her, that he would grow up not with shame, but with pride. But even as the world elevated her to a symbol, she wrestled with the weight of it. She had not asked for this spotlight. She had not sought recognition. She had only wanted to keep her baby safe. Yet she understood now that survival itself had become a form of resistance, and that resistance carried responsibility. One evening, as she prepared to testify before the city council, she sat alone, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of Titan, her old K9 partner, and the lessons he had taught her about loyalty and trust. She thought of the soldiers she had led, men who had learned to follow her voice because they knew it carried calm even in chaos. She thought of her community, tired but unbroken, waiting for someone to say what they had felt all along, that their lives were worth protecting, their dignity worth defending. When she stood before the council, cameras flashing, reporters scribbling, she didn't speak like someone delivering a speech. She spoke like a mother, like a veteran, like a woman who had nothing left to fear. You asked me to tell you what happened, she began, her voice steady. But you already know. You've seen the videos. You've read the reports. The truth is not hidden. What I want to tell you is this. I have worn your uniform. I have carried your flag into battle. I have watched men die under it. And I have buried a dog who saved lives in its shadow. I know what loyalty looks like. I know what courage looks like. And I know what justice is supposed to look like. What I saw that night was not justice. It was abuse. What I felt was not protection. It was persecution. And what I learned was this. Dignity will always rise, even when you try to bury it under fear. Her words were met with silence, the kind of silence that carries more weight than applause. The officials shifted in their seats, some embarrassed, some ashamed, some hardened against the truth. But the cameras had captured every syllable, and the people outside the building cheered when her voice was broadcast to them on loudspeakers. Weeks later, changes began. Policies on K9 deployment were rewritten. Oversight committees expanded. Training programs scrutinized. It was not enough, not nearly enough, but it was something. And it began because one woman refused to be broken, because one mother chose to stand. At home, she kept her life simple. She sang her baby to sleep, cooked meals in her small kitchen, laughed with neighbors who now saw her as both friend and fighter. She accepted the gratitude of strangers, but reminded them always, this isn't about me. It's about us. It's about every life that deserves dignity. Her baby grew, his first words forming, his small steps unsteady but determined. Each milestone reminded her of why she had stood her ground, of why she had faced down snarling dogs and men with weapons. She wanted him to inherit not her battles but her strength, not her wounds but her pride. And so, when she walked down the street now, head high, child in her arms, she carried more than her own story. She carried the story of a community that had found its voice, of a people who had remembered their power, of a nation reminded that dignity is not granted by badges or uniforms, but lived in the courage to say enough. She had once been a soldier. She had once commanded dogs in foreign wars. But now, she was something more powerful, a mother whose voice had cut through silence, a woman whose dignity could not be stripped, and a reminder to the world that true authority is not taken, it is earned. And though she knew there would be more battles, more nights of fear, more headlines that weighed heavy on her people, she also knew this. She had faced down their weapons with nothing but her voice. And she had won. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a soldier can do is not fight a war overseas, but protect the peace at home. And sometimes, the loudest roar comes not from sirens or barking dogs, but from the quiet, unshakable dignity of a black woman holding her child in the face of injustice, unbroken, unbowed, and unforgettable.